Egypt's forgotten queens and cursed tombs. Hey everyone, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, maybe grab a drink, something calming, not cursed, preferably. Tonight we're drifting back thousands of years to a land that still feels strangely alive under its dust, ancient Egypt. But don't worry, we're not here to chase mummies or decode hieroglyphs at top speed. No, tonight's story moves at the same pace as the Nile in midwinter. Slow, meandering, and maybe a little melancholy. Because we're not talking about the big names. Not your Cleopatras or Nefertitis or your "look how symmetrical my tomb is" pharaohs. No, we're talking about the ones history sort of forgot to mention. The women who were once queens, mothers, priestesses, now reduced to a few carvings, a cartouche half erased, or a body no one bothered to label properly. These are Egypt's forgotten queens. And if you've ever felt overlooked at work, underappreciated in your own family, or like your best efforts were buried under someone else's pyramid, well, you'll get along with them just fine. Let's float back to around 1800 BCE, to the Middle Kingdom, the time when Egypt was at that awkward teenage stage, too old for pyramid building marathons, too young to realize the world doesn't revolve around it. Our first quiet protagonist is Queen Sobeknefru. Her name literally means the beauty of Sobek, Sobek being the crocodile god, so right off the bat, she's got interesting taste. Sobeknefru was the last ruler of the 12th dynasty, and minor detail, the first confirmed female pharaoh in Egyptian history. Not just queen consort, not great royal wife, but pharaoh, full regalia, fake beard, and everything. And here's the fun part. Nobody really remembers her, which is ironic because she did everything possible to be remembered. She built monuments, she added her name to temples, she tried to make the female pharaoh thing happen centuries before Hatshepsut did it better. And still, history basically ghosted her. Why? Because her reign lasted only about 3 or 4 years, and Egypt at the time was falling apart politically. Think of it like a kingdom-sized midlife crisis. Her dynasty ended with her death, and the next rulers basically pretended she didn't exist, which, in pharaonic terms, is the historical equivalent of unfollowing someone and deleting all your old photos together. Her tomb? Still missing. Her mummy? Gone. Her memory? Almost wiped out, until modern historians pieced her story together from broken statues and a few inscriptions. Sobeknefru is one of those queens who reminds us how fragile royal glory really was. You could wear the crown, run the show, even claim divine parentage, and still end up as a trivia question in someone else's museum tour. Let's drift down the river a few centuries, to a time when Egypt's rulers were starting to get weirdly into divine family trees. Here we find Queen Amos Nefertari. Now this one was not forgotten in her own lifetime. Quite the opposite. She was practically worshipped. She was the great royal wife of Pharaoh Amos I, the guy who finally kicked the Hyksos out of Egypt and reunited the kingdom. Together, they launched what we now call the New Kingdom, Egypt's Golden Age. And while Amos was busy doing all the typical pharaoh things like conquering cities and commissioning enormous temples, Amos Nefertari was quietly building a reputation that would outlast both of them. When she died, Egyptians literally made her into a goddess. People prayed to her for centuries afterwards, especially in Thebes. Her face shows up on tomb walls long after anyone remembered why. But here's the eerie part. When her mummy was found in the Deir el-Bahari cache, it was not divine. Her teeth were worn down, her skin leathery, her mouth frozen open mid-decay. She'd been moved multiple times, stripped of valuables, and finally dumped in a collective pit of displaced royals like an afterthought. So yeah, divine for a while, then boxed and forgotten. Egypt had this habit of honoring its queens with one hand and erasing them with the other. Now, let's glide into the 18th dynasty, basically Egypt's celebrity era. If this were a Netflix docuseries, this is where the dramatic music would kick in and we'd get close-up shots of eyeliner and gold leaf. Enter Queen Hatshepsut. Yeah, okay, she's not totally forgotten, but she almost was. And that's kind of the point. Hatshepsut started out as the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I, then became the queen consort of her half-brother Thutmose II, because, Egypt loved to keep things in the family. When he died, she was supposed to just step aside and let the child heir, Thutmose III, take over. But instead, Hatshepsut looked at the throne and said, "Actually, I think I'll keep this." And she did. For over 20 years. She wore the crown, took the royal titles, and even had herself depicted as a man in statues. Flat chest, false beard, the whole ensemble. It was bold. It was effective. It was inconvenient for everyone else. Because after she died, Thutmose III basically went on a full-blown historical revenge tour. He had her name chiseled out of monuments, her images smashed, her statues buried. Ancient Egypt's version of, "Don't ever mention my ex again." For centuries, historians thought Hatshepsut was this obscure footnote until archaeologists realized, oh wait, this mystery male pharaoh was actually a woman the whole time. So even though her tomb was built magnificently in Deir el-Bahari, terraces, pillars, all that look-at-me energy, she spent millennia erased and only recently reclaimed her place. Her mummy? Found in 2007, unlabeled in a side chamber, identified by a tooth fragment. Talk about forgotten royalty. One of Egypt's greatest rulers, reduced to a single molar in a box.
Now, while Hatshepsut's tomb was grand, not all queens got the luxury of architecture that screamed, "Please remember me forever." Some, like Queen Tiye, preferred quiet power. Tiye was the wife of Amenhotep III and the grandmother of the infamous Tutankhamun. She was one of the most influential women of her time. Foreign ambassadors literally mentioned her in letters because she was that politically relevant. But then came her son, Akhenaten, the pharaoh who decided Egypt's thousands of gods were just too mainstream and tried to switch everyone over to worshiping one, Aten, the sun disk. A bold move. And by bold, I mean catastrophically unpopular. Tiye had to watch as her son's religious experiment tore apart Egypt's centuries-old traditions. She probably didn't agree, but at that point, what do? Ground your divine son? When she died, her mummy ended up in a hidden royal cache. Again, the once great matriarch of the Amarna age wrapped up and tucked away like a side note. Let's float over to the most famous royal name of them all, Tutankhamun. Yes, he's technically not a queen, but the women around him, oh, they're the real story. Take Ankhesenamun, his wife, and also his half-sister, because Egypt really loved to make the family tree look like a circle. After Tutankhamun's death at around 19, she found herself in an impossible position. Young, widowed, and surrounded by scheming priests and generals. So she did something shocking for her time. She wrote a desperate letter to the king of the Hittites, Egypt's northern rivals. She begged him to send one of his sons to marry her, promising him to make him king. Imagine the scandal. A pharaoh's widow asking a foreigner to rule Egypt? It was practically treason. The Hittite prince actually started the journey, but he was murdered before he even reached Egypt. Enkisenamun vanishes from the record shortly after. No tomb, no body, nothing. One of Egypt's most tragic love stories, erased like it never happened. Speaking of vanishing acts, we can't forget Nefertiti. You know her, the queen with the famously perfect limestone bust that somehow survived every revolution, museum move, and fashion trend for 3,000 years. For a while, Nefertiti and her husband Akhenaten were basically Egypt's golden couple. They posed together in sunlit reliefs, surrounded by their daughters, basking in Aten's divine rays like influencers in the world's oldest brand deal. Then, she disappears.
Some scholars think she died early. Others think she changed her name and ruled alongside Akhenaten as co-pharaoh. Some even suggest she outlived him and reigned briefly as a mysterious figure called Neferuaten. Her mummy? Never found. Her tomb? Still missing. But the irony is delicious. One of the most recognizable faces from antiquity, and we still don't actually know where she ended up. And then there's Queen Tausret. She ruled at the end of the 19th dynasty, stepping in as pharaoh after her husband and stepson both conveniently died, because apparently Egypt's royal family had the same survival rate as a soap opera cast. Her reign didn't last long. Civil war broke out, the kingdom fractured, and her successor did what Egyptian successors always do, erased her name. Her tomb in the Valley of the Kings, KV-14, was looted, repainted, reused, and eventually mistaken for someone else's. Even in death, Tausret couldn't keep her own space. If there's one pattern to all of this, beyond the mummification and weird eyeliner, it's that Egypt's queens lived in a world built to forget them. The pharaohs got their temples, their grand narratives, their look upon my works speeches. The queens? They got tucked behind cartouches, their names overwritten, their stories lost to time. But in a strange way, that makes them more haunting. They're not the loud, triumphant kind of remembered. They linger quietly, in fragments, inscriptions, and half-buried tombs that archaeologists still stumble into by accident. Somewhere in the desert, their stories are still waiting. All right, we've covered a lot of royal dust tonight. From crocodile queens to erased goddesses, from perfect faces to missing tombs. Next time, we'll keep drifting, deeper into the sand, where the tombs get stranger and the curses start sounding suspiciously like bad karma. But for now, just let the Nile carry you downstream. Sleep well, and maybe, if you dream of ancient queens tonight, remember, they've been waiting a long time to be remembered. The Cursed Tombs, Whispers from the Valley of the Kings. Hey again, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations, you've survived another royal bedtime story. Tonight, let's slip even deeper into the sand. Deeper than dynasties, deeper than dusty museum displays. Because while Egypt's forgotten queens faded into history, their tombs didn't. The tombs are still here, breathing softly under the dunes, whispering through cracks in limestone. And for thousands of years, they've been telling the same story to anyone who dares listen. Do not enter. Of course, humans being humans, that's exactly what we did. So tonight, we're drifting through the Valley of the Kings. Not the touristy version with gift shops and guardrails, but the quiet, original one. The place where the air itself feels old enough to judge you. The valley sits on the west bank of the Nile, across from Thebes, because in Egypt's belief, the west was the land of the dead. The sun set there every evening, and in theory, so did you. The valley's cliffs rise like fossilized waves, scarred with dozens of entrances, some royal, some fake, some, let's just say, regrettable. Each tomb was supposed to be eternal, each one a house for the afterlife. But eternity, as it turns out, is very bad at keeping secrets. Let's start with one of the earliest and strangest tombs, the tomb of Amenhotep II. When archaeologists first entered it in the 19th century, they found something that even Egyptologists found creepy, and that's saying something. There, lying in neat rows around the king's sarcophagus, were bodies, dozens of them. They weren't random mummies, they were other royals, queens, princes, and even a few lesser pharaohs, all stacked like a royal storage closet. Turns out, later priests had gathered up vulnerable royal mummies from looted tombs and hid them in here for safekeeping. It's kind of sweet in a morbid way. Imagine being a divine ruler in life, only to end up sharing your eternal resting place with a dozen other people because someone ran out of room. Egypt, home of eternal glory and budget burial solutions. Then there's VK5, the tomb of Ramses II's children. This one is absurdly huge. Over 100 chambers, twisting and branching like an underground beehive. For decades, it was thought to be just another side shaft. Then, in the 1990s, archaeologist Kent Weeks decided to check again and realized it was basically the world's biggest family crypt. Ramses II had over 100 children, because of course he did. He ruled for 66 years, had multiple wives, and apparently zero chill. And it seems many of his sons ended up here, buried together, because even in death, Ramses couldn't stop organizing family reunions. Imagine the awkwardness of that afterlife dinner table. Hi, I'm Ramses Jr. number 47. No, not that Ramses Jr. The air inside VK5 is thick, claustrophobic, filled with the faint smell of gypsum and regret. And though it's one of the grandest tombs ever built, no inscriptions name the sons buried there. No individual tributes, no honors, just silence. Even royal offspring, it seems, were replaceable. But no story of Egyptian tombs would be complete without the one name even people who don't like history know: Tutankhamun, the boy king, the golden wonder, the accidental celebrity of archaeology. His tomb, VK62, was discovered by Howard Carter in 1922 after years of failure, frustration, and a very patient sponsor named Lord Carnarvon. When Carter first peered through the sealed doorway and was asked what he saw, he said, "Wonderful things," which was Victorian for, "Holy crap, everything's gold." Inside, the tomb was untouched. 4 rooms crammed with furniture, jewelry, chariots, and food, all meant to help a teenage king navigate eternity. It was small compared to other royal tombs, almost modest, probably because Tutankhamun died suddenly, and his burial was rushed. They just grabbed the nearest available tomb and stuffed it full of treasure. Still, that didn't stop it from becoming the most famous archaeological discovery in history. And then, of course, came the curse. Now, the curse of the pharaohs wasn't new. It's been around since ancient times. Egyptians inscribed warnings on tombs like, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs this peace," which sounds poetic until you realize some of the explorations actually did die afterwards. Lord Carnarvon, the financier of the dig, died suddenly a few months after the discovery. Blood poisoning from a mosquito bite that got infected after he nicked it shaving. At the exact moment he died, the lights reportedly went out in Cairo.
His dog, back in England, supposedly howled and dropped dead. Now, does that sound like coincidence? Probably. But does it make for a great bedtime story? Absolutely. Carter himself lived another 17 years, completely fine, which kind of ruins the curse narrative. But people ignored that part. The newspapers couldn't resist. Pharaoh's curse strikes again became a headline template. Every archaeologist with a mild cold suddenly made front-page news. And thus, the myth was reborn. A mix of superstition, colonial guilt, and early 20th century melodrama.
Let's take a quieter detour, away from kings and into a tomb most tourists never hear about. Tomb KV35, belonging to Amenhotep II, held one of Egypt's strangest surprises. When it was reopened in the 1890s, archaeologists found an unmarked side chamber filled with bodies, royals again, hidden for protection. Among them was an unidentified young woman, her body twisted in agony, mouth open in a silent scream. They called her the Younger Lady. For decades, nobody knew who she was, until DNA testing revealed she was Tutankhamun's mother. And yes, before you ask, her brother was his father. Because ancient Egypt. Her resting face, forever caught between pain and confusion, feels like a symbol of what royal life in Egypt really was. Glorious in theory, claustrophobic in practice. Speaking of confused burials, there's KV55, another mystery tomb connected to that same royal soap opera. Inside was a desecrated coffin with erased names, a damaged mummy, and traces of gold foil once bearing Akhenaten's insignia. For a while, people thought it was Akhenaten himself. Then others argued it was his son, or a backup mummy, or maybe a reburied relative. Egyptology became less about answers and more about educated guessing. Even today, nobody's 100% sure. The tomb seems to mock us, like it's saying, "Oh, you thought history was linear. That's adorable." And then, tucked in the cliffs nearby, there's KV64, a relatively recent discovery. This tomb was sealed in antiquity, untouched for millennia, until it was found in 2011 by a team of Swiss archaeologists. Inside, just one coffin, a woman named Nehemis Bastet. She wasn't a queen or even a royal relative. She was a temple singer, a priestess of the cat goddess Bastet. Her tomb was modest but carefully made, her wooden coffin still intact, her name preserved. It's strangely comforting that after all the royal chaos and erasures, one quiet woman devoted to music and worship managed to sleep undisturbed for 3,000 years. No curse, no looters, no drama, just peace. Let's float back for a moment to the big question. Why were the Egyptians so obsessed with tombs? It wasn't vanity, at least not entirely. They saw death as a continuation, a second act that needed preparation. You'd need food, furniture, makeup, pets, even board games. Eternity was basically one long, well-furnished nap. The tomb wasn't just a burial, it was a portal. The walls were covered in spells from the Book of the Dead, guiding the soul through trials, tests, and awkward divine encounters. You didn't want to wander the afterlife unprepared. That would be like showing up to an eternal dinner party with no invitation and no pants. So they built elaborate homes for eternity. But the irony is, those same tombs, meant to protect them, ended up exposing them. Because every door, every secret passage, every hidden chamber eventually called out to someone curious enough to dig. Let's whisper about one more queen before we rest for tonight. Queen Hatshepsut, mother of Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid. Her tomb was discovered accidentally in 1925, near the base of the Great Pyramid. Inside were dazzling treasures, beds, chairs, gold, canopic jars, all perfectly arranged. But her sarcophagus was empty.
No mummy, no bones, no trace of her body. The leading theory? Her first tomb had been robbed, so priests moved what they could to a safer location, but somehow lost track of her. So the queen mother of Egypt's most famous pharaoh ended up with all her stuff, but none of herself. It's poetic in a bleak way, like being remembered only for your furniture. If you walk through the Valley of the Kings today, it feels peaceful. The sun burns the cliffs a blinding gold, and the air hums faintly with cicadas. The tomb entrances gape like dark mouths, silent but heavy with memory. You can almost feel the layers of time pressing in, the footsteps of priests reburying sacred mummies, the chisel marks of workers carving prayers for eternity. The sighs of archaeologists opening sealed doors and realizing they've just unleashed 1,000 headlines. And somewhere beneath all that, the queens we talked about, Sobeknefion, Ti, Nefertari, Ankhesenamun, lie half-remembered, half-erased, and their names still echoing faintly under the sand. Every tomb in Egypt whispers the same message, really, that power fades, gold tarnishes, monuments crack, but memory, fragile as it is, somehow survives. A queen might vanish from history books, but all it takes is one archaeologist, one late-night documentary, or one sleepless listener to bring her back for a little while. Maybe that's why these stories still haunt us, not because of curses, but because they're reminders that even the most eternal people in history weren't.
The afterlives for forgotten women, from tomb robbers to museum glass. Hey again, welcome back. If you're listening to this, it probably means you've survived the sandstorms, the curses, and the collective trauma of ancient embalming techniques. Congratulations! Tonight, we're not staying in the tombs. We're leaving them, slowly, quietly, following the trail of what happened after Egypt's queens were buried. Because their stories didn't end underground. They were rearranged. Bodies moved, names erased, jewelry stolen, mummies packed in boxes, shipped across oceans, labeled with typos, and displayed under fluorescent museum lights. So, let's dim the lights again and take a soft walk through what I like to call the second afterlife, the strange modern world that Egypt's forgotten women accidentally entered. Let's start where we left off, the Valley of the Kings. After the fall of the New Kingdom, Egypt basically went through centuries of political chaos. Dynasties came and went faster than you could update a family tree. Tomb robbing became an industry. Priests, guards, even royal officials joined in. Because when the economy collapsed, the gold inside those tombs suddenly looked very practical. And it didn't take long before Egypt's queens, once worshipped as divine mothers, became commodities. Their jewelry was melted, their bodies stripped of wrappings for amulets and medicine. Yeah, medicine. In medieval Europe, ground mummy powder, called mumia, was literally used as a cure for everything from headaches to heartbreak. So, if you ever feel like it is a dignified subject, just remember European apothecaries once sold powdered Egyptian queens in jars. Now, not every mummy was destroyed. Some were lucky, or unlucky, enough to be rediscovered in later centuries and sold as curiosities. During the 19th century, when Egyptomania swept Europe, mummies became the ultimate dinner party entertainment. Wealthy Victorians would literally host unwrapping parties, where they unrolled ancient bandages in front of guests, like some kind of grotesque birthday surprise. It was science, spectacle, and sheer ego all mixed together. Imagine Queen Tiye, once the most powerful woman in Egypt, being unwrapped on a London stage by men who thought she was Cleopatra. The room smells of dust. The crowd gasps. Someone makes a joke about curses, and everyone claps politely. Then they sweep her remains off to a museum storeroom. That's the part of history we rarely talk about. The queens didn't just vanish. They were disassembled and renamed by people who thought they were studying them. Let's float over to one of the most famous examples, the cache of Deir el-Bahari, discovered in 1881. A hidden chamber filled with more than 50 royal mummies, carefully reburied by priests thousands of years ago to protect them from looters. Among them were Hatshepsut, Amhot's Nefertari, Tiye, and many more. The royal family reunion no one asked for. When these mummies were brought to Cairo, the crowds lined the streets. Egyptians watched as their ancient rulers, once divine, now dusty, were paraded on carts through the city. People threw flowers. Some wept. Others crossed themselves or whispered prayers. It was surreal, a funeral procession 3,000 years late. And for the queens, it was probably their 4th or 5th burial. Then came the museums. The Cairo Museum became their new afterlife. Air-conditioned, labeled, photographed, cataloged. Each mummy assigned a number, a case, a curator. But even that didn't guarantee peace. In the early days, mummies were shipped off to foreign collections in London, Paris, Berlin, New York, wherever a collector could pay enough. Sometimes they were mislabeled. Sometimes, hilariously, 2 different museums claimed to have the same queen. Queen Nefertari's coffin fragments scattered across multiple institutions. Hatshepsut's statues split up like souvenirs. Even fragments of tomb paintings were sold by the square inch. The afterlife had become fragmented capitalism. Let's stop at the British Museum for a second. In the Egyptian wing, under soft yellow light, stands the famous bust of Nefertiti's contemporary, the younger lady's possible likeness, though most people confuse them. Visitors take photos, whisper, "Wow," and move on to the next case. But what they don't realize is that the queen behind the glass, whoever she was, spent more time in modern storage than she did in her own tomb. Every label, every glass panel, every alarm system is a modern spell, a new kind of immortality. She's seen by millions, but never known. It's immortality without identity. Now, while Europe was turning ancient queens into display pieces, Egypt itself was going through its own rediscovery. In 1922, when Tutankhamun's tomb was found, Egypt became a global sensation overnight. The world rediscovered pharaohs, but not so much their queens.
Cleopatra stayed famous, of course, because she fit the Western image of beautiful, tragic woman. But queens like Ankhesenamun or Hetepheres, still invisible. Even in modern exhibits, female rulers often end up in the supporting character section, next to their husbands, sons, or gods. You can almost hear them sighing from behind the glass. Still playing second fiddle, huh? There's something strangely poetic about this. Egyptians believed in Ka and Ba, 2 parts of the soul. The Ka stayed with the body. The Ba could roam, but both needed a name to survive. If your name was forgotten, your soul faded. So what happens when your name is mispronounced, mislabeled, or misfiled in a museum database? It's like a second death, one that no pyramid can protect you from. But here's the twist. Every time someone stops, reads a plaque, and says that name out loud, the Ba stirs again. Which means, in a quiet way, we're the priests now, the caretakers of their memory. One of my favorite modern stories is about the Royal Mummy Parade in Cairo, 2021. If you missed it, Egypt literally gave its ancient rulers a red carpet ceremony. 22 royal mummies were transported from the old museum to the new National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. Each one had a custom-built, climate-controlled case. The streets were closed. There were lights, music, and choreography. And as they rolled past the crowds, each name appeared on screen in golden letters. For the first time in thousands of years, Queen Ahmose Nefertari, Queen T, and others were formally honored again. It was weirdly moving. No digging, no theft, no spectacle. Just acknowledgement. As if Egypt finally whispered back, "I remember you." But not every story ends that gracefully. Some mummies are still missing. Sobekneferu's tomb has never been found. Ankhesenamun vanished completely. Nefertiti, still missing, still debated, still mythologized. Every few years someone claims to have found her, then they haven't, then they have again. It's like an eternal game of archaeological hide and seek. And maybe that's fitting. Because if history has one rule, it's that the most interesting people are never easy to find. Let's drift to one last quiet corner of history, the private collections. All over the world, forgotten queens exist in fragments. A gold earring in Boston, a Ushabti figurine in Madrid, a coffin lid in Toronto. Pieces of one woman's eternity scattered like breadcrumbs across continents. And yet, even in those fragments, something survives. Archaeologists can reconstruct faces now, identify DNA, trace ancient illnesses. Sobekneferu's temple foundations, long lost, are being re-examined. T's hair, yes, actual hair, has been studied under microscopes. Every tiny rediscovery pulls them a little closer from the shadows. They'll never have the grand monuments again, but they're still remembered, pieced together in quiet labs and narrated documentaries. History has a funny way of coming full circle. If you've been listening this long, you might have noticed something gentle beneath all the dust and decay. It's not just tragedy, it's persistence. The queens of Egypt were erased, rewritten, mislabeled, forgotten, but never truly gone. Their bodies were stolen, but their stories lingered in the air. Every generation digs them up again. Not just archaeologists, but storytellers, artists, and even you, lying in bed right now, half awake, listening to their names drift past like whispers on the Nile. They never asked to be remembered this way, under museum lights or in sleepy podcasts. But it's better than silence. Maybe eternity doesn't look like gold or glory. Maybe it sounds like this. Soft voices, long after the tomb doors have closed, still telling their stories to anyone willing to listen. So tonight, if you close your eyes, imagine this. queens, curses, and the eternal drama of power. Hey again, sleepy travelers. Still with me? Good, because tonight we're gliding deeper into the moonlit corridors of ancient Egypt, where politics, perfume, and paranoia all mixed together like some cursed royal cocktail. We've wandered through the sands with Teddy Sherry and Ahotep, watched the rise of Hatshepsut and the unraveling of her legacy, and now we drift into the hazy twilight between golden glory and divine exhaustion. This is the age when Egypt's queens held more eyeliner than actual power, and when tombs whispered louder than living courtiers. So fluff the pillow, get comfortable, and let's sink into the soft, slightly musty glow of Egypt's 18th and 19th dynasties, where curses felt personal, love triangles lasted for centuries, and the gods themselves probably rolled their eyes. Let's begin with Queen Tiye, the original "don't mess with me" woman of the Egyptian court. She wasn't born royal, no divine lineage, no golden cradle. Her father was a wealthy cattle herder. Her mother? A nurse. In other words, she came from what ancient nobles would have called respectable middle-class peasantry. But somehow, Tiye managed to marry the pharaoh Amenhotep III, one of Egypt's most powerful kings. Now, imagine that wedding. Everyone expecting a fragile little noble-born princess, and instead, in walks Tiye, intelligent, politically shrewd, and radiating that quiet confidence of someone who's already read everyone's secret scrolls. Amenhotep III didn't just love her, he listened to her, which in ancient Egypt was basically revolutionary. She appeared next to him in official art, was mentioned in diplomatic letters, and had her own foreign correspondences. That's like being the Beyoncé of the Bronze Age. Foreign kings would literally write letters addressed to her, not him. One Hittite king actually sent her jewelry. Yes, jewelry. Which probably made Amenhotep III go, "Wait, what?" She ruled as queen consort for nearly 4 decades, steering her husband's reign with a mixture of grace and quiet manipulation, until her son, Amenhotep IV, later known as Akhenaten, decided to blow up 2,000 years of tradition. Now, Akhenaten was different. He looked different: long face, soft belly, narrow chest, hips like a fertility goddess. He acted different, rejecting all the old gods in favor of one, Aten, the sun disk. And his mother, Queen Tiye, well, she tried to keep the royal train from derailing. Imagine being Tiye, watching her son tear down temples, rename himself, and build a whole new capital in the middle of the desert, all while claiming to be the sole prophet of the sun. She must have thought, I did not raise him for this. And then came Nefertiti. Ah yes, Nefertiti, the queen whose cheekbones could probably cut papyrus. Everyone knows her from that famous bust in Berlin, the elegant neck, the regal crown, the gaze that says, "I know more than you ever will." But behind that beauty was a woman who essentially co-ruled Egypt. She wasn't just the pharaoh's wife, she was his ideological twin. Some even think she briefly ruled as pharaoh after Akhenaten's death, maybe under the name Neferneferu Aten. Together, they tried to reinvent Egypt as this utopian, sun-worshipping paradise. But like every utopia, it turned into a logistical nightmare. People didn't like abandoning their gods, the priests were furious, and the treasury started bleeding gold faster than a leaky tomb wall. When both Nefertiti and Akhenaten disappeared from history's record, it wasn't elegant, it was messy. Their city, Amarna, was abandoned, Their names were chiseled off monuments. Even their tombs were left unfinished, as if Egypt itself had decided to move on. And that's when we drift into one of the strangest royal mysteries, the Amarna aftermath. Somewhere between the ruins of Akhenaten's dreams and the restoration of Egypt's old religion, a young boy stumbled into power. His name? Tutankhaten, later changed to Tutankhamun because, well, politics. Tutankhamun's reign was short, barely 9 years, but it was packed with behind-the-scenes intrigue. He was married to his half-sister, Ankhesenemun, one of Nefertiti's daughters, because of course he was. Egypt loved a good genetic loop. He spent most of his rule trying to undo his father's religious chaos, reopening temples, rebuilding statues, pretending none of that one God-only business ever happened. And then he died, mysteriously, at 19. Now, his death launched what can only be described as a royal soap opera with funerary decor. His widow, Ankhesenemun, was suddenly alone. No heirs, no protection. So she did something shocking. She wrote to the Hittite king, Egypt's biggest rival, and said, "My husband is dead. I have no son. Send me one of yours, and I will make him king of Egypt." Which in ancient diplomacy was basically the equivalent of texting your enemy, "Hey, wanna move in?" The Hittite king was intrigued. He actually sent one of his sons, a young prince named Zenanza. But the poor guy never made it. He was murdered en route to Egypt. No one knows by whom. Some say it was Tut's old advisor, clearing the way to marry Ankhesenemun himself, which he did. And then she vanished from history entirely. It's one of those eerie Egyptian silences, like a tomb with the name rubbed out. Centuries later, Howard Carter would stumble into Tutankhamun's tomb, still sealed and glittering in gold. The boy king had been forgotten by everyone, buried in a tiny tomb probably meant for someone else. When it was opened in 1922, the newspapers called it the Curse of the Pharaohs, because naturally a few people involved in the discovery died mysteriously afterwards. In truth, probably just coincidence, or bad hygiene. But it didn't stop the myth. Suddenly, every archaeologist's death was the curse. It made Egypt's afterlife seem alive again. Poetic, in a creepy way. Tutankhamun's ghost went from an obscure mummy to a global celebrity. Posters, novels, movies, even breakfast cereal, all for a boy who barely ruled a decade. As we drift through the flickering torchlight of these queens and kings, Tiye, Nefertiti, Ankhesenemun, you can almost feel Egypt's golden age exhaling. Each of them tried to hold on to something eternal: love, power, faith, beauty. But Egypt, like the Nile, just kept flowing, washing over them, burying their names in dust. And yet, thousands of years later, here we are, still whispering their names into the dark.
Because in Egypt, no one ever really stays forgotten. Not the queens, not the curses, not even the boy who became a bedtime story. So, let's rest for a moment here, beside the sealed tombs and their golden echoes. Next time, we'll float into the twilight of Egypt's power, when queens became pawns, tomb robbers got creative, and the gods seemed to stop answering the phone. Until then, breathe in, relax, and remember, the sand always keeps its secrets. Queens of the twilight, the last ladies of a fading empire.
Hey again, fellow night wanderers. Still cozy? Still awake enough to follow a dynasty or two? Perfect, because we're slipping quietly into the later centuries of Egypt, the part where everything starts feeling a little tired, like a kingdom that's been up too long and really needs a nap. The gold is still gleaming, the temples still smell like incense, but the confidence, that unstoppable ancient swagger, is fading. Foreign powers are circling, the pharaohs are not what they used to be, and the queens, they're doing their best to keep the eyeliner from running as everything around them starts to crumble. So dim the torches a little lower. Let's drift into the age of Egypt's forgotten queens, the last women who tried to hold back the tide before the sand swallowed it all. Our first stop is Queen Tawasret, Egypt's final queen of the 19th dynasty. Tawasret wasn't supposed to rule. She was the wife of Pharaoh Seti II, a guy who spent most of his reign dealing with family drama that could rival a modern soap opera. After he died, his young heir, Siptah, took the throne, and Tawasret became regent. Now, ancient Egypt loved a good regency, mostly because it gave powerful women a chance to quietly run the show while pretending not to. But Tawasret didn't stay in the background. When Siptah died suddenly, and suspiciously conveniently, she crowned herself pharaoh. Imagine it, a woman sitting on the throne of Ra, wearing the royal beard, claiming divine authority in a world full of suspicious generals. Bold move. For a while, it worked. She ruled as Pharaoh Tawasret, building temples, minting her own images, and keeping Egypt afloat through sheer determination. But soon, an ambitious man named Setnakte, founder of the 20th dynasty, rose up and took the throne. Tawasret vanished from history. Her monuments were usurped, her name erased. Her tomb, though beautifully decorated, shows signs of hurried plundering, a fitting metaphor for Egypt itself at the time. Still, she left behind an echo, the last woman to hold the title of pharaoh until Cleopatra, over 1,000 years later. After Tawasret, Egypt's queens slipped into the background. Less rulers, more decorations. The 20th and 21st dynasties brought waves of instability. Power flickered between priesthoods, military families, and occasionally ambitious foreign rulers. But among the fading dynasties, a few women still glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. Take Queen Motkare Mutimhat, a high priestess of Amun and royal daughter. She wasn't a ruling queen, but she wielded immense religious influence during the 21st dynasty, one of those shadow queens who ruled through ritual, not armies. Her mummy, discovered in the Deir el-Bahri cache, still had a serene expression, her long hair preserved, her body wrapped with exquisite care. Even in decay, she radiated quiet dignity, a reminder that sometimes the softest power is the most lasting. And then came the Libyan queens. Yes, Libyan. By the late New Kingdom, Egypt had become a kind of dynastic Airbnb. Foreigners came in, took the throne, and decorated everything in their own style. The 22nd and 23rd dynasties were filled with rulers of Libyan descent, and their wives and daughters often held dual roles as both queens and priestesses. One name stands out: Queen Karamama, a graceful figure immortalized in a bronze statue so delicately cast it almost feels alive. Her expression? Calm, intelligent, a little wistful, as if she already knew the empire she represented was slipping away. By the 25th dynasty, Egypt was ruled by the Kushites, kings and queens from Nubia, south of Egypt. And if you thought the story ended there, surprise, it actually gets fascinating again. Because the Kushite queens, known as Kandakes, were formidable. They weren't decorative figures or ceremonial spouses. These women commanded armies, led religious rituals, and sometimes negotiated directly with foreign powers. They were tall, regal, often depicted with strong, rounded features, and they wore crowns shaped like lions, because subtlety was clearly overrated. One queen, Amenetere, restored temples in both Nubia and Egypt. Another, Amenisheket, faced down Roman threats with pure nerve. Their reigns outlasted some of Egypt's later native dynasties, proving that the idea of divine queenship was far from dead. It had just migrated south. But while Nubia thrived, Egypt itself, well, it was crumbling. By the time we reached the late period, Egypt had become a revolving door of conquerors. Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, each left their mark. Each built their own temples beside the ruins of the last. And through it all, the image of the Egyptian queen, the serene, divine, all-powerful woman, lingered like a perfume that refused to fade. In temple reliefs, they're still shown offering to the gods, eyes lined, posture perfect. Even if the actual women behind those images were probably wondering if the treasury still had enough gold to pay the guards. And then, at last, there was Cleopatra. Yes, we'll get to her soon, the final flicker of Egypt's royal fire. But before she takes the stage, it's worth pausing to appreciate what came before her. From Tetisheri's quiet strength to Hatshepsut's ambition, from Ti's intellect to Tausret's defiance, Egypt's queens weren't just ornaments, they were architects of power, survivors of dynastic chaos, and occasionally the only adults in the room. The gods might have favored men on paper, but history, real, living, chaotic history, was often steered by women in gold collars and kohl eyeliner. So here, in this fading chapter, we find them, the forgotten queens of the twilight. They ruled when the Nile still gleamed, when the temples still sang, but the world was moving on. The sand crept higher each year. The tombs closed their mouths. The gods grew silent. Yet even now, their names whisper through the limestone corridors. Tausret, Taramama, Mutemhat, echoes of grace in a kingdom half asleep. So take another slow breath, because next time we'll meet the woman who refused to let Egypt die quietly, the queen who played Rome itself like a game of dice.
Cleopatra, the last pharaoh who refused to die quietly. Hey there, night listener. Still awake? Or maybe half asleep, somewhere between dreams and dynasties. Perfect, because this next part is the story everyone thinks they know. The face on the coins, the queen wrapped in legend, eyeliner sharper than her politics, and a reputation that somehow outlived an entire civilization. Yes, tonight we float down the Nile one last time to meet Cleopatra VII Philopator, the woman who tried to keep Egypt alive with charm, strategy, and just enough scandal to keep historians gossiping for 2,000 years. So take a slow breath, picture the river glinting under the moonlight, the distant sound of reed flutes, the faint smell of lotus and incense, and there she is, reclining on a golden barge, smiling like she knows exactly how this story ends. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE, which for Egypt was already the after-party of empire. The pyramids were ancient history, the temples were museum pieces, and the once great pharaohs had been replaced by Greek-speaking kings from the Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals. In other words, Egypt was Egyptian in name only. The royal family was Macedonian Greek, spoke Greek, married each other, of course they did, and spent most of their time pretending to be gods
while dodging assassinations at dinner. Cleopatra's family tree? A full-on labyrinth of sibling marriages, betrayals, and bad decisions. Her father, Ptolemy XII Aulates, was called the flute player, not because he was musical, but because he was, apparently, kind of a fool. He loved Greek wine, Roman parties, and overspending Egypt's treasury on political favors. At one point, Rome literally had to reinstall him on the throne after his own people kicked him out. So Cleopatra grew up watching her father grovel to senators and bribe generals. Not exactly the strong role model you'd hope for. But she learned. Oh, she learned. When Aulates died, Cleopatra became queen, co-ruler, technically, with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. And because this was the Ptolemaic dynasty, the natural next step was to marry her brother, which she did. Ancient Egypt's motto might as well have been, "Keep it in the family," no matter how many family members you have to poison later. The first few years of Cleopatra's reign were rough. Famine hit, taxes went wild, and before long her advisors, or rather her brother's advisors, pushed her out. She fled to Syria, regrouped, and began planning her comeback, which conveniently lined up with a little Roman civil war drifting her way. Enter Julius Caesar. Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BCE, chasing his rival, Pompey. But when Pompey landed in Egypt, the boy king's court, desperate to impress Rome, killed him immediately and presented Caesar with his severed head, which, let's just say, wasn't the welcome gift Caesar expected. He was horrified. Cleopatra, however, saw an opportunity. Now, this is where legend kicks in, and where history gets flirty. The story goes that Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's chambers, rolled up in a rug. When the rug was unfurled, out tumbled the young queen, perfumed, poised, and entirely aware of her dramatic timing. Whether or not it actually happened, it worked. Caesar was enchanted. Cleopatra was restored to power. And her brother? Mysteriously drowned in the Nile shortly after. History doesn't record whether she sent flowers. Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers, of course. She was about 21, he was 52, and already married. Scandalous? Definitely, but effective. She gave birth to a son, Ptolemy XV, nicknamed Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. Subtle. Very subtle. Cleopatra even traveled to Rome, where she lived in a luxurious villa across the Tiber while Caesar showered her with gifts and public attention. The Romans were not amused. They called her the Fatal Woman, the Eastern Witch, the Serpent of the Nile. Basically, ancient tabloid headlines. Then, just when it looked like she might become the most powerful woman in the known world, Caesar was assassinated, stabbed 23 times in the Senate, and Cleopatra, sensing danger, quietly slipped back to Egypt with her son. Now here's where Act 2 begins. Rome was in chaos again. Civil war, rival generals, endless backstabbing, the usual. Out of that mess emerged two key figures, Antony and Octavian, later Augustus. Antony was charming, reckless, fond of luxury, and possibly allergic to good decisions, which meant Cleopatra was basically his soulmate. Their meeting in 41 BCE is one of the most cinematic moments in ancient history. Antony summoned her to Tarsus to explain her role in the civil unrest. Instead of showing up like a guilty vassal, Cleopatra arrived on a golden ship with purple sails, silver oars, and attendants dressed as cupids. The ancient historian Plutarch describes it like this: "The barge was adorned with gold, the sails of purple, the oars of silver, moving to the sound of flutes and harps." Antony didn't stand a chance. She invited him to a lavish feast full of incense, jewels, and subtle reminders that she was, in fact, divine. By the end of the night, he was hers, politically, personally, hopelessly. Their love affair was half romance, half political alliance, and 100% public theater. They threw wild banquets, formed a drinking club called the Inimitable Livers, yes, really, and paraded through Alexandria dressed as gods. Meanwhile, Antony's reputation in Rome sank faster than a barge in the Nile. To Romans, Cleopatra was no longer a queen, she was an infection, the Eastern enchantress corrupting one of their own. Octavian seized on this, painting Antony as a traitor enslaved by lust. He released propaganda saying Antony planned to move the capital of the empire to Alexandria. The scandal was perfect, and so began the final war of the Roman Republic and Cleopatra's last stand. In 31 BCE, the Battle of Actium decided everything. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet faced Octavian's navy off the coast of Greece. The winds turned, the battle went wrong, and in the middle of the chaos, Cleopatra's ships suddenly turned and fled. Antony followed. The rest of the fleet collapsed. They returned to Egypt, defeated, exhausted, surrounded. Octavian marched in. Antony, broken by humiliation, fell on his own sword. Cleopatra locked herself in her mausoleum, surrounded by gold, tapestries, and artifacts of her vanished kingdom. When Octavian's soldiers finally reached her, she was dead. The story says she took her own life with the bite of an asp, the symbol of divine royalty, though the truth might have been poison. She was 39 years old. And just like that, Egypt was gone. Octavian annexed it as a Roman province. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, was executed. The great temples of Isis and Ra fell silent. The language of the pharaohs faded to whispers in the desert wind. But Cleopatra, the woman herself, never faded. Rome wrote her as a villain. Renaissance painters made her a muse. Shakespeare turned her into poetry. Modern historians keep rediscovering her, not as a seductress, but as a ruler, strategist, and survivor in a world built to erase her. She wasn't Egypt's ruin, she was its last heartbeat. So, as the torches burn low and the Nile drifts by, maybe we can see her more clearly now, not as the temptress or the tragedy, but as the final flicker of a civilization that refused to die quietly. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, the woman who made history sigh instead of shout. And maybe that's where we'll let the sand settle for tonight. Next time, we'll drift through Egypt's afterlife, the strange centuries after the pharaohs, when Greek priests, Roman emperors, and Christian monks all fought over the memory of Egypt's divine queens. But for now, close your eyes, breathe slow, and let the Nile carry you toward sleep. Because Egypt never really ends. It just changes shape in the dark.
Egypt after the queens, when Rome stole the crown. Hey again, dream traveler, still drifting with me down the river of time? The torches are dim now, the air is cooler, and the echoes of Cleopatra's laughter have faded into the stone. We've left behind the golden thrones, the cobra crowns, and the shimmering perfume of power. Now the Nile flows quieter, under a different flag, Rome's flag. Egypt has been conquered. The gods are silent. The tombs are sealed. But the story, somehow, still keeps breathing. So tuck yourself a little deeper under the blanket. Tonight, we wander through Egypt's afterlife,
Not the one with Anubis and feather scales, but the long, strange centuries after Cleopatra's fall, when Egypt became a jewel in someone else's crown. When Octavian, now calling himself Augustus, took Egypt in 30 BCE, he didn't just annex a country, he seized a legend. Rome was obsessed with Egypt. It wasn't just another province, it was the land of mystery, gold, and divine glamour, the kind of place Roman poets couldn't stop writing about, even when they got the details completely wrong. Augustus, though, was cautious. He didn't want another Cleopatra situation, someone charismatic enough to turn Egypt into their personal kingdom. So he made a few rules, big ones. Roman senators weren't allowed to visit Egypt without his permission. That's how paranoid he was about someone using Egypt's wealth to fund a rebellion. He put a Roman prefect in charge, not a governor, not a noble, just a loyal bureaucrat. Egypt wasn't a province like any other. It was the emperor's personal property. And the Egyptians? Well, they kept doing what they'd always done. Farming, worshiping, building, and quietly outliving everyone who conquered them. But Cleopatra's death left a kind of cultural vacuum, and Rome rushed to fill it with myths. In Roman art and poetry, Cleopatra became the ultimate cautionary tale. Beautiful, dangerous, and foreign. A woman who ruined men, destroyed empires, and had the nerve to die on her own terms. The real Cleopatra, the strategist, the linguist, the ruler who spoke 9 languages, got buried under the propaganda. Roman coins even depicted her with exaggerated features, making her look harsh and masculine. It was all part of the narrative. See, Rome didn't lose to beauty. We defeated evil. But beneath that spin, fascination simmered. Cleopatra's image haunted Rome like perfume on a ghost.
Meanwhile, life in Egypt changed. The temples of Isis and Osiris still thrummed with chants, but more and more of them started using Greek and Latin inscriptions alongside hieroglyphs. The priests adapted, the gods were renamed, and the statues of pharaohs started to look suspiciously Roman around the nose. In Alexandria, once Cleopatra's capital, the library still flickered with scholars, astronomers, and mathematicians. The city became the intellectual nerve center of the empire. One of its most famous residents was Claudius Ptolemy, the astronomer. No relation in Cleopatra's family, just another Ptolemy in a long list of them. His model of the universe, with Earth at the center, would rule Western thought for over 1,000 years. So even after the pharaohs were gone, Egypt was still shaping how the world thought about time, stars, and gods. Then came the Romans themselves, moving in like moths to golden flame. Roman emperors started styling themselves as pharaohs in Egyptian art. Augustus, Tiberius, even Nero, all had hieroglyphic inscriptions claiming divine favor from the ancient gods. It's funny, really. The conqueror is trying to look like the conquered, hoping to borrow a little of Egypt's immortal shine. And Cleopatra's image? It didn't fade. It morphed. Roman emperors named their mistresses after her. Artists painted her death again and again, sometimes tragic, sometimes seductive, always fascinating. She became more than a woman. She became a symbol of empire, desire, and the curse of ambition. But empires, like people, don't stay young forever. By the 3rd century CE, Rome was crumbling too. Plagues, revolts, inflation, too many emperors, not enough sanity. Egypt's temples still functioned, but now cracks were showing, literally. The hieroglyphs that once flowed like sacred poetry were forgotten. Fewer priests knew how to read them. The language of the Nile slowly fell silent. And then, Christianity arrived. It started small.
communities meeting quietly, praying to a single God in a land of many. But by the 4th century, Christianity had become the empire's official religion. And with that, the gods of Egypt, Ra, Isis, Osiris, and Anubis, began to fade into myth. Temples were closed, statues defaced. The last hieroglyphic inscription we know of, carved at Philae Temple, dates to 394 CE. After that, silence. For the first time in 5,000 years, Egypt's gods had no worshippers. But history has a strange sense of humor, because the new faith didn't erase the old symbols, it transformed them. The image of Isis with baby Horus became an inspiration for Mary and the Christ child in early Christian art. Ancient Egyptian festivals were rebranded as Christian holidays. Even some desert monasteries were built on top of ruined temples, like spiritual recycling. And while priests were gone, Egypt's deserts filled with monks, silent, meditative, seeking eternity in the same sands that once buried pharaohs. It's almost poetic, the kingdom of the dead becoming the birthplace of solitude and reflection. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell. Byzantines ruled Egypt, then came the Arabs, then the Ottomans, and through it all, Cleopatra's ghost and the whisper of the queens before her never quite left. Travelers from Europe wrote wild stories about golden tombs, cursed mummies, and queens who bewitched men across time. By the 1800s, Egyptomania swept across Europe again. Mummies were unwrapped at dinner parties. Napoleon scholars rediscovered the hieroglyphs, and with the Rosetta Stone, the lost language of the pharaohs finally spoke again. When Champollion cracked the code in 1822, the past came roaring back to life. For the first time in 1,500 years, the words of Hatshepsut, Tai, Nefertiti, and Cleopatra could be read, not imagined. And somewhere you have to imagine, the sand sighed in relief. So now, as we stand in the quiet glow of the present, the story feels complete. Egypt's queens have gone, but not really. Their temples are ruins, their tombs looted, their names half broken on stone, and yet we still speak them. Because something about them, the mix of beauty, power, and loneliness, keeps us looking back. Maybe that's their true immortality. So take one more slow breath. The river is calm. The moonlight ripples. The queens are at rest, but their stories still hum beneath the surface.
The sand remembers. What Egypt's queens taught the world about immortality. Hey again, Night Wanderer. You made it all the way here, through dynasties, betrayal, tombs, and curses. And now, we've reached the quiet part, the last ripple on the Nile. So let's slow down. Let the torches burn low. Let the hum of history settle like dust in the air. Because tonight isn't about power or bloodlines anymore. It's about memory, the strange, stubborn thing that outlives everyone. Egypt's queens are gone. Their cities have crumbled. Their palaces are ruins under layers of sand and time. But somehow, their stories keep resurfacing, like the Nile in flood season. Every few centuries, someone rediscovers them. A traveler brushes dust off a statue's cheek. A scholar translates a name that hasn't been spoken aloud in 3,000 years. And just like that, they live again. That's Egypt's real magic. It was never just about gold or gods or pyramids. It was about the belief that nothing truly dies if it's remembered. The ancient Egyptians had a word for that, Ren. It meant name. As long as your name was spoken, you existed. The moment people stopped saying it, that was the real death. So they carved their names on walls, statues, temples, anything that might outlast flesh. They filled their tombs with portraits, hymns, and letters to the gods, not out of vanity, but survival instinct. Because eternity to them wasn't a gift, it was a craft. Something you built with memory, word by word, stone by stone. And maybe that's why Egypt still feels so haunting. It's a civilization built on the idea of remembrance. Look at Hatshepsut, the queen whose stepson tried to erase her from history. Her statue smashed, her name chiseled out, and yet her temple at Deir el-Bahari still stands. Her story was pieced back together thousands of years later by archaeologists who could almost feel her personality in the architecture. Proud, elegant, defiant. That's immortality. Not the kind promised by gods, but the kind granted by human curiosity. Or Nefertiti, the beautiful enigma. Her name meant the beautiful one has come. But what she brought wasn't just beauty, it was revolution. She and Akhenaten tried to remake religion itself, to strip Egypt down to one God, one truth, one sun. And though her face vanished for centuries, when her bust was uncovered in 1912, the world stopped. Her eyes, calm, unreadable, seemed to look right through time. It's strange, isn't it? How one fragment of painted limestone can undo 3,000 years of silence. Then there's Cleopatra, the last pharaoh and the one who never quite died in the public imagination. Rome tried to erase her. Medieval chroniclers turned her into a villain. Shakespeare turned her into a tragic lover. Hollywood made her a goddess in gold eyeliner. Each version wrong in its own way, but each keeping her alive. If Hatshepsut's immortality came through stone, Cleopatra's came through story, through art, theater, obsession. She became a symbol so strong that it barely matters what's true anymore, because the idea of Cleopatra outlived her bones, and that too is a kind of resurrection. But it's not just queens. Even the nameless artisans who built the tombs left messages carved into the walls of their workshops. Be happy, for you will not be forgotten. They didn't know who would read it, maybe no one, but they wrote it anyway. Because to write was to exist. To carve was to breathe. That's the quiet defiance of Egypt, the belief that memory itself is sacred. You can see it in the temples of Luxor, in the symmetry of Karnak, in the hieroglyphs that spiral like poetry. Every symbol whispers the same idea. Don't look away. Remember me. And we do. We build museums and documentaries and bedtime videos about them. We turn their lives into art again, because something about them refuses to vanish. Even the sand, which swallows everything else, seems to protect Egypt's secrets until the right moment to reveal them again. That's why the pyramids are still standing, not just because they were well built, but because they were built to be seen, to outlast empires, languages, and even meaning itself. Maybe that's the lesson their queens left us, that immortality isn't about living forever. It's about leaving something behind that makes someone, somewhere, pause and feel you again. It could be a monument, or a story, or just a name whispered in the dark. So as we drift to the end of this long, dusty river, remember this: the sand remembers. It remembers every footstep, every crown, every whisper carried by the wind. And it will remember you too, if you leave something worth finding. The night is still now. The moon is high over the Valley of the Kings. The temples hum with silence, and the Nile moves like liquid shadow. Somewhere beneath that endless sky, Hatshepsut sleeps. Nefertiti dreams. Cleopatra smiles, just slightly. Their tombs may be broken, their gods forgotten, but their stories still alive. So close your eyes, let the sand settle, and drift with them into eternity. Because history, like the Nile, never really stops flowing.